Elise Rosemary, and I'm a Senior Vice President here at AKAM. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be discussing understanding New York City's garage and structural inspection mandates. Today, we are joined by our esteemed colleagues over at the Midtown Preservation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I have Kathleen Needham-Inocco joining us, as well as Dennis Mele. They are founding partners at Midtown Preservation Architecture and Engineering, which has been established in 1990, and their firm represents over 200 cooperatives and condominiums throughout New York City. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And then we have our very own Chris Alker, who is our own registered architect. And Chris oversees our operations and compliance, as well as he is a state registered architect and has focused on New York City architecture for almost 20 years, I guess over now at this point. And he is fabulous as well. So thank you both so much for joining us today. We're going to get started on our content. Also, just so you know, feel free to ask questions throughout. We welcome them into the Q&A chat. And as we see them, we will ask away. So let's get started. Thank you.
Well, I'll get started. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Chris, and all the good people at AKAM. We are so happy to join you today. Dennis and I are very, very happy to share 40+ years experience restoring these parking garages and high-rise structures throughout New York City. And we hope you will find our presentation informative. I guarantee you will never look at parking garages the same way again. We have a lot of lessons learned over the last 40 years, and we're thrilled to be sharing them with you here today. There's a lot of information here, so we've composed a PowerPoint presentation, but in order to keep it a little bit more casual, I invite Elise or Chris or Dennis to stop and contribute with insight and comments and experiences as we go along. So we're going to jump right in. Okay, so I'd like to start with objectives of what we're going to achieve today. We're going to review the garage failures, which provided the impetus for New York State's parking garage assessment mandate. New York State requirements and the mandate were actually the precursor to New York City's. So it's important to take a look, particularly if anybody has a parking structure outside of the 5 boroughs. New York City's new 2022 building code in Article 323, the periodic inspection of parking structures, and rule of City of New York 103.13 provide all of the information that we'll need to get through the New York City's mandate, which is currently in progress. We're going to talk about the protocols for conducting an initial assessment of a parking structure, including examples of typical conditions, structural safety, maintenance issues, on-site evaluation, and developing a repair strategy. We're going to talk about special concerns for various types of construction, and then various garage repairs, building a team, cost of the work, negotiating a contract, starting the work, and operation disruptions, and in particular garage leases, which have been a big bone of contention as to who is responsible for this law. I'd like to start with a quick disclaimer. The information in this document is only a summary and overview and is certainly not intended to substitute for the full text and meaning of any law, rule, or regulation. The information contained is current as of the date of presentation. You'd be surprised how many times we've made presentations and a day later we get an addendum to the law to change everything. So it's current as of today, and we will also be sharing a lot of opinions, of which we have many, but please remember they're only our opinions. So I'm going to start with where New York State's mandate first emanated. In 2015, there were a series of garage failures throughout the country. And we're going to look at 2 quick examples. This is Harmon Plaza in Secaucus, New Jersey, Sunday morning in a shopping center. As you can see, the garage was not loaded with cars and very little snow. There was a plow clearing the snow, which then collapsed right through the slab from an overloading situation. And then the Johnson City Medical Center in July of 2015 became the spark for New York State implementing their mandate for garage inspections. And this also was a two-story structure. The ramp collapsed, the upper deck collapsed. 24 vehicles were trapped. Luckily, no one died in either of these accidents. But this became the framework for New York State, realizing that these structures were aging. They were 40 to 50 years old and needed to be periodically inspected and assessed by a structural engineer every few years. So New York State, I'm only going to, I have one slide for the mandate for New York State because it is important. As I said, it was the precursor to New York City. If your structure is located outside of the 5 boroughs, initial condition assessment is required prior to the certificate of occupancy even being issued on new buildings. And as of August of 2018, you're required to have an operating permit and periodic condition assessment of all parking garages every 3 years in the state. Depending on the date of original construction, the initial condition assessments were due prior to October 1st of 2019, 20, and 21, and cycle 2 is currently underway for the older structures. Assessment must be performed by an authorized engineer with 3 years minimum experience in structural evaluations, unlike New York City, who will pre-qualify and certify the engineers. New York State is more on the honor system for engineers that are truly structural engineers and work in parking garage evaluations and design. So all garages in New York State, both public and private, must comply. The only exemptions are 1 and 2 family residences or any structure with a single level of parking on grade. And that's important because in New York City, so many of our garages are located in basements, which is a slab on grade. New York City does not have the same exemption. So New York State established minimum standards and leaves it up to the local authorities in the various cities, towns, villages, state agencies responsible for administrating and enforcing this law. We find it quite ironic. Although we understand that big cities like Albany and Rochester are enforcing this law, we have several projects on Long Island, and we've been to various local town building departments asking how to file these reports and what the requirements are. And we're met with blank stares because the word really hasn't spread around to a lot of the smaller building departments. So eventually there'll be, I hate to say it'll be an accident and everybody will all of a sudden realize that they're supposed to be doing this. New York City has, early on, New York City advised us that they are exempt from the state laws because they have its own building code. So then New York City decided they were going to implement a parking structure mandate as well. In order to do so, they have to implement it into the building code. So every few years, the New York City building code is evaluated, it's updated and republished. And we are now in the new 2022 building code, and the Department of Buildings incorporated this new law into the 2022 code. So it was passed by City Council in October of 2021. It became law in November of 2021, known as Local Law 126 of 21. Now, everyone seems to be referring to this parking garage law as Local Law 126, but the truth is that Local Law 126 really includes the entire revamping of the New York City 2022 building code, not just the parking garage. Article 323, the parking structure compliance, became effective on January 1st of 2022. So although the entire building code was effectively revamped in November of 2022, the parking garage compliance section became effective in January. Then the building department leaves it up to the, City Council leaves it up to the building department to establish rules as to how the reports will be written, what the inspection requirements are, fee structures, civil penalties, and that's called RCNY 10313, which was published June 22 of 2022. So we are currently in cycle 1, 1A to be precise. The Article 323 in the new code states that the owner is responsible for the proper inspection, repair, and maintenance of the parking structure. Now, this is important because many garages are leased, and a lot of the leases make the lessee responsible for the maintenance or repair. And so a lot of owners are scrambling to see who is going to be responsible to comply with this new law. But the building department is holding the owner responsible, not the garage operator. So the condition assessment by the professional engineer, and a report's required every 6 years, unlike New York State, which was only 3. The engineer must be an approved agency by the DOB. As I said, the DOB will be issuing certifications to engineers who are qualified, and the acronym would be a QPSI. We have 3 two-year subcycles similar to the facade law, with the first report deadline due December 31st of this year. As we said, cycle 1A started January 1st of 2022, so the 2-year cycle ends this December 31st. The subcycles have been set up by boroughs and community districts, and there's an annual observation by owners' agents, which can be non-professionals, in addition to the formal reporting every 6 years. In addition, the engineer must develop an observation checklist and cite the timeframes, and record the checklist observations must be maintained at the garage. The DOB will be around to check these checklists and will issue violations if they're not kept up to date. There's a condition assessment report where the PE must classify each condition as safe, unsafe, or safe with engineering monitoring, called SREM, as prescribed by the Department of Buildings. And we will talk about the definitions in just a moment.
Kathy, can I interrupt and just ask on the because you did mention the who the DOB will hold responsible, and you mentioned the potential violations. What if my parking structure is a condo? How will they know who to give the violation to? How's that work?
So my opinion on that is based on numerous conversations with the Department of Buildings. And what we are told is that if a garage is located, let's say in a residential structure, and the residential structure has the building identification number, meaning that the garage is not an independent structure with its own building ID. If it's located within the building, the DOB generally uses the HPD's database, and the corporation listed as the owner of that condominium will be the one held responsible and will get the violation. And that's what we're told.
Thank you.
Kathy, real quick, was the precursor to this the Surfside incident, or had this been in the works?
That's great. Actually, it was in the works before that. New York, various states have implemented garage assessment laws prior to even 2015. So New York was talking about it for a while. 2015 became the final point where there are just a number of failures that occurred that year. I know of at least 6 that occurred throughout the country prior to July of 2015, and that became the final straw. So when New York implemented in 2018, it was already in effect before Surfside. But it's certainly justification, and the DOB, New York City DOB, has used it as a justification to include the cellar structures where the columns that support the floors above actually rest on the foundation in the basement level. Going back to Article 323, we're going to include a record of potentially unsafe conditions, condition of structural frame and members, any visible reinforcement and connections. We have to cite all the conditions of slabs and slab joints. And as I said, we have to provide an annual observation checklist, and we'll look at an example in just a moment. The engineer or the owner must notify the DOB immediately of any unsafe conditions. So if the engineer is not on site and the owner or the garage operator detects what they consider an unsafe condition, it's the owner's responsibility to make sure that is reported to the Department of Buildings. We become very unpopular when we come on sites and declare unsafe conditions, but it is a very, very serious situation, and you want to make sure you can comply. It would be considered a criminal offense if something happened, it wasn't reported. So it's very important. If the building is unsafe, they immediately must secure the public, safeguard the area, and commence repairs. If a building is identified with SREM conditions, safe with repair and engineering monitoring, the engineer must identify the proposed monitoring program. And if repairs are not immediate, if repairs are not immediate, and recommend repair and establish all the timeframes for the repair. Stability analysis with a factor of safety showing the structure is stable under anticipated loads. Now, this is contained in Article 323. We really don't know to what extent the department will actually enforce this. I consider this very important, and that's why it's in bold. I think that in order to do a stability analysis, if you don't have the original drawings showing all the framing members or the steel reinforcement within the reinforced concrete, it's very complicated and requires very extensive and destructive probes in order to cut holes into the slab and the walls and to locate all your steel reinforcement and structural members, spacing, in order to do the stability analysis. So I consider this, very important. This could be a very costly item, but once again, we don't know if the building department is really going to leave it up to the individual engineers who are filing these reports, or if they're going to enforce it throughout on every filing. So let's just look at a couple of concerns on building garages. There's exposure to de-icing solutions. We have motor oil, we have traffic, often open to the elements. Salt and water, the two biggest culprits for failures of the building structures. Defects are very easy to be hidden because people don't spend a lot of time in garages. They're typically not well lit. And honestly, garage maintenance is not a popular expenditure. There are many buildings we've been looking at and analyzing and repairing for 30 years or so. And I can't even tell you how many times we've been asked to look at the garage in conjunction with the building assessment. So it's not a popular expenditure, and there are many boards who have not looked at their garages in many, many years. Although the parking attendants usually know where all the problems are, they hide them up with sheets of plastic and deflectors. So in New York City, we're also concerned because they're often at the basement level, which we just mentioned earlier, which means the columns can support many stories above, and they're very critical to maintain. So who's responsible to be doing these filings? As we said, it's the building owner, not the parking operator, regardless of the lease agreement or regardless of the individual ownership in a condominium situation. All buildings or portions used for parking or storing motor vehicles must file, include all spaces inside or under the building. The only exemptions are auto body and auto repair shops, showrooms, service stations, garages with occupancy of less than 3 cars, private garages for 1 and 2 family homes, and unenclosed, unattached outdoor lots. So we don't have that exemption of cellar structures. The DOB has been collecting data of all the garages in the city, to preparing for their violations, particularly at the end of cycle 1A now. That's coming up in December. And right now they have less than 4,000 structures counted to date. I suspect they're going to be probably closer to 6,000 by the time they're finished. So we're going to take a look at who's responsible to file when. So as we said, we're in cycle 1, and we have 3 2-year subcycles, 1A, 1B, and 1C. So we are presently in 1A. In 1A, if you look at the map on the right, if you're located in Manhattan, all of Lower Manhattan, south of 59th Street, is required to file this cycle prior to December 31st, as well as the Upper West Side up till Community District 7, which is up to 110th Street. The Upper East Side, which would be Community District 8, and all of Northern Manhattan, as well as all of Brooklyn, are required to file in subcycle 1B, which commences January of 2024 and deadline of December 31st of 2025. And then 1C is all of Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. And that's from 2026 to 2027. So if your building is subject to FISP because there's a high-rise structure above your garage, you may choose to move your filing window to correspond with your FISP filing. And this way you don't have to worry about two separate deadlines. We really don't know how that's going to work out because the parking garage mandate is every 6 years and the facade deadlines are every 5 years. So I think you're going to be filing the garages a little bit more frequently, but it's just easier to manage. You have the engineer inspecting both the garage and the superstructure. So you have that option, but you must request this change 108 days prior to your assigned subcycle deadline. So that means if you're in subcycle 1A, which is going on now, you have till July 1st to ask the building department if you want to move your filing window to coincide with your FISP.
I imagine that it's because they're stating that you have to use certain engineers and you can't use everyone, that you want to get this process moving quicker, because I imagine those engineers are going to get very busy.
That's correct. And actually, the Department of Buildings publishes a list of all the engineers who are certified to file these reports. And the same with the facade law. There are QEs. The acronym is QE, Qualified Exterior Wall Inspector. I think there are about 200 QEs right now in New York City. Conversely, there are only about 40 QPCs, the Qualified Parking Garage Inspectors, that are presently certified. There are many more that are waiting to be interviewed, and we'll talk about the requirements. But there are not a lot of certified inspectors. And there are many buildings that have had architects inspecting their structures for many, many years. The architects are excluded, even though the architects have been repairing garage structures for many years, and they report and repair the facades and roofs and balconies. They're excluded from the parking structures. So many buildings have long-time relationships with their architects and are not looking to make a change. So the QPC may be an independent agency that you bring in specifically for the garage. So who can perform these inspections? As we said, just the QPCs, the only engineers allowed to file. You must be a New York State registered professional engineer with 3 years of structural engineering experience related to parking structures. We have to submit a resume and 3 projects to the Department of Buildings, and we have to pass an interview to show we understand the engineering and mechanics of how a garage is supported. The QPC, though, can assign tasks and supervise other individuals, employees, under their supervision that have relevant experience or education. Once again, that would exclude any architects. It's only individuals, even if they're not licensed, the QPC can assign tasks to engineering graduates who have relevant experience.
We're okay with that.
So, absolutely, so it's appropriate. So in the inspection process, we have the QPC must conduct a condition assessment and then file the report. So also a review of all structural design repair drawings, any FISP reports, because the facade may or may not be included in the evaluation. There's a previous compliance reports that have to be reviewed and all prior annual observation checklists. Once again, these are in addition to the compliance report and may not be performed by a professional engineer. You can assign a garage operator, could be the building superintendent. Similar to the inspection of the sidewalk bridges, where the superintendents, when the contractor is not present, fills out the logbook and keeps it handy in case the building department comes around. It'll be along the same line. The QPC must design a condition assessment program to include inspection methods based on the type of construction, the age, materials, exposure. So the QPC is designing the program and will design and also will decide how much hands-on physical examination will be required, conducting visual examinations, maybe cameras, binoculars, but the building department is insisted that at least 10% of every structural element, so that would be your beams, your columns, your slabs, must be included. So you're going to need contractors now. You're going to need some scaffolding set up. You're going to need maybe, perhaps if the QPC determines, you might need to do load testing. You may have to do core drilling and maybe non-invasive infrared scanning, depending on what the conditions are. So as you can see, the costs are going to rapidly mount and doing these assessments, and you may not know upfront exactly what the final cost is going to be, depending on what is discovered as the inspections are being conducted. So in the condition assessment we're including is this as per the DOB, all structural components, fireproofing, waterproofing, guards, rails, parapets, ramps, wearing surfaces. Appurtenances including roll down gates, attendance booths, lighting, staircases, bollards, barriers, charging stations, equipment attached to the structure. But we're excluding any mechanical lifts where the public is prohibited. Many of the garages have mechanical elevated type structures to move the cars. That is excluded from this inspection. The facade of the parking structure is not required if the building is otherwise subjected to FISP, meaning it's a high-rise structure over 6 stories, or the garage takes up less than 50% of the total building square footage. So if it's an independent parking structure that's all parking, then the facade must also be included in this evaluation. If not, then the facade would be either with FISP or it would be a low-rise building that's not subject to the facade inspection.
Kathy, could I ask, in terms of the structures, what could you just really generally speak to how are the parking garages built in New York City in terms of the materiality and sort of, I guess, structural system, and how that might relate to garages upstate that precipitated this law? Because I assume there's some differences.
There are differences, and we're going to look in just a little bit at 3 of the main types of construction that we have here in New York City. Predominantly, we're going to see steel frame structures where the steel, because it's inside the building, is encased in concrete for fireproofing reasons. So the framing is pretty much composed of steel members, as I said, encased in concrete. But then you have reinforced concrete structures where you have poured concrete and steel reinforcing rods to provide the tensile strength for the concrete structure. And then the third type of construction that we see in New York City are precast slabs, where you have big slabs of concrete which are cast in laboratories, or I should say various
pretty big laboratory, right?
The controlled environment, and as the steel reinforcement is much easier to keep control of when it's in a factory setting as opposed to in the field, you know, with the concrete trucks pulling up and pouring the concrete. So those are the 3 different types of structures we're predominantly going to see, and there are 3 different things that we look for. Across the state, there are some wooden structures. Obviously, you're not going to see that in New York.
A wooden parking garage?
There are wooden parking garages in New York State, yes. Wow. But other than that, the construction is similar with the precast,
steel frame, you know, is occasional. You'll see.
So the medical center and the other you mentioned at Secaucus, they were what type of structure were they?
So the one in Secaucus was steel frame. And you can, if you look closely at that photograph, you can see where the connection of the beam at the column sheared off, and you can see right where it gave way. And if you look at the position of that little Bobcat with the full payload of snow in it, it was right directly over that beam near that connection when it gave way. So that was a steel frame structure that failed.
Thank you.
So in the report requirements, we're going to document the existing conditions, and the engineer must classify every condition that's noted as unsafe, safe with repair and engineering monitoring, and safe. I just note here, these are the definitions in the rules of the Department of Buildings has published. Unsafe condition is a condition that's hazardous to persons or property and requires repair within a 1-year time frame. And I say that because most people think unsafe or hazardous means it's immediate. The building department views it that it's a repair that requires less than a year. So there are conditions that we may decide can wait a few months to get the contractors and on board and specifications and whatnot. But the Department of Buildings will consider it immediate, even if if the engineer decides it can last for a year. Safe with repair and maintenance means that the safe at time of inspection but requires repair within a time frame between 1 year, but less than 6 years. So any condition that's noted by the engineer must be corrected no later than your subsequent inspection, which would be 6 years hence. So if you don't correct that condition, then the condition is automatically deemed unsafe in the next cycle. It's similar to the facade law. Not all unsafe classifications really represent unsafe structures. It's a technicality that if you don't correct your condition in time and follow the law, the building department is deeming your structure unsafe.
And do we anticipate that they will be giving, associated violations and monetary penalties because they'll know that you have sat on something?
Absolutely. And later on, I have an overview of the penalty and violation fees that would be assigned. And as you know, they're very vigilant with the facade law. The same department or kind of a subsidiary of the department is going to handle the parking garages, and they're going to be just as vigilant with the violations for the parking garages.
It is really very similar to the facade law in its structure. Safe with repair or unsafe. The big difference is if you're safe here, if you're unsafe with the garage, there you have the ability to, just cordon off certain areas where there may be an overhead condition that's unsafe, and you're not losing the complete use of the garage. With
So
the
it's an
facade law,
unsafe condition.
if you're an unsafe facade, you got to put a sidewalk bridge up and leave it there kind of indefinitely.
Right, so you can
They
sort of
do
localize
allow
the
you
repair.
Yeah, they do allow you to sort of compartmentalize the unsafe areas.
Mm-hmm.
And, then the garage operator is going to lose a couple of parking spots here and there. So there's some other things to take
What
into
about,
consideration.
and totally left field here, I'm sure we know, and I don't know if we know I'm sure you know the answer to this. We're seeing everybody, like Dylan goes electric, everybody's buying electric cars. I think it's now 10%. Does an electric car weigh more than a regular car? And what happens in 10 years when everybody has an electric car?
Well, charging stations is one of the things that you have to look at, include in this report.
Well, I was thinking more car weight than I am how you fuel it.
I don't know how the gross vehicular weight of an electric vehicle matches up with a car.
It's the same.
I don't know if it's the same, but they're making SUVs that are going to be electric. They're making pickup trucks that are going to be electric, all sorts of vehicles, makes and models are going to be electric, and the batteries are very heavy. You don't have a tank filled with gas, but you have other, weights.
So I'm guessing the live load per square foot on a parking garage is conservative regardless, so it'll cover that differential.
Yeah, we haven't seen, look, does that not mean that Albany or there's going to be some national standards for changing the required design loads for parking garages as people's lifestyles and motor vehicles change over time? It's very possible.
Mm-hmm.
They're constantly rewriting the code, and that may be something that comes to fruition, somewhere down the road.
Real quick, do all cars have to be removed for the inspection?
Generally, no, unless unless a garage is in very poor condition. We certainly are not going to inspect during peak hours. And there are times we have to inspect depending on how the garage is used. There are times we have to inspect at night or very early in the morning because we want to have as few cars as possible. But if the garage is in poor condition and we need to do a further evaluation or test or sounding, the cars will need to be moved. Generally not, vacated, but certainly, we need to see more of the structure than full capacity of having the cars there.
And we also have another question. If an owner initiates unsafe repairs within 1 year and then safe with repairs between 1 to 6 years, but completion of the repair exceeds that 1 year and the 1 to 6 year period, is the owner going to be subject for violation? Or 2?
So I'm a little, okay.
So I think if the owner is starting to initiate their unsafe repairs within the first year, and then they're labeled safe, but still need to do repairs within 1 to 6, and their completion of repair, they're working on it, but exceeds that time frame that's been allotted, will they still be subject to violation even though they're working on it?
So the timeframes are very structured at the Department of Buildings. It's very similar also to the facade law. If you're unsafe, you enter a different universe at DOB, and there are very strict guidelines we have to follow. You have 90 days to correct the unsafe condition. If you can't correct within 90 days because you need to create specifications and bid it out, and the very few repairs can be completed in 90 days. You just have to make sure that the structure is stabilized, and then you have to apply for time extensions every 90 days to show the department that you are working towards that repair. And there are times unsafe conditions take 3 or 4 years to complete, very frequently. Because of extensive amount of work. The Department of Buildings will work with you as long as they see you're making progress and all precautions have been taken to make sure that no one is endangered. If you have different timeframes for unsafe and for SREM, and some repairs have to be done right away, you complete that. The professional will file an amended report, take you out of unsafe classification, make the building then classified as SREM, S-R-E-M, and then you can comply with the regular timeframes the QC has designated, maybe 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. So that's perfectly acceptable as long as the QC takes you out of the unsafe classification. And if you're still in unsafe, you have to report back to the building department every 90 days. And if you follow those regulations, you will not be subject to any penalties or violations.
Great, thank you.
Real quick, we have a fact checker here, and he looked up the average gross vehicular weight of electric vehicles compared to conventional motor vehicles. And on average, they're about 250 pounds more. So they are heavier.
But the garages are all constructed with a factor of safety of at least 3. So I think that it should be safe as long as the building is constructed the way it should have been, because that so frequently we see during constructions, very poor placement of steel rebars. And if it's not constructed correctly, if the connections are not made appropriately, the structure is not going to hold up to the loads for which it was designed to hold. And as I showed in those photographs of the failures, those garages weren't even fully loaded, not even half loaded at the time the collapse occurred.
So I should get the Tesla.
Kathy's going to speak in a moment about, people just overloading garages, and what your certificate of occupancy says and what people are actually doing is a big problem. So
that's right. Anyone who's parked in New York City takes a look at how they pack in those cars. So I can assure you those garage structures are not designed for those loads. So going back to the report, we're going to show photographs of all the conditions. We're going to have a site plan indicating all the work locations. Very important because you want to be location specific. Because you can't carry over a condition from one cycle to the next. You can't have an engineer write a condition up like they used to years ago on the facades. Oh, spalling concrete throughout the structure. You have to show, you want to be very location specific. It's very important and it'll protect you. The unique annual observation checklist, and these reports must be submitted within 60 days of the QPC's final inspection. There are many times engineers inspect structures. By the time they prepare the report, get the owner's signature, months elapse. The Department of Buildings will require the QPC to return to the structure and make a follow-up inspection if it's not within 60 days, and they do enforce this. Unsafe conditions, as we said, we're going to notify the DOB immediately, whether it be the owner or the QPC. Install protection, safeguard the public. You may need to vacate or partially vacate, depending on what the condition is. The QPC must submit an immediate report and commence repairs immediately. And as we said, if you can't do it within 90 days, you file time extensions. An amended report within 2 weeks of completion of the unsafe, and this is the same as the facade law as well. If we have SREM conditions, the owner must correct within the QPC specified time frame, or the structure is deemed unsafe in the next cycle. Same condition, as we said, cannot be at the same location, cannot be filed for 2 consecutive cycles. And that's why it's important to be location specific. Monitoring program, if necessary by the engineer. So this is interesting, and I'm not sure how this is going to work. We have this annual observation checklist, but in addition, if your garage is classified as SREM, you might have to have a monitoring program where the engineer has to come back annually to make sure that condition is not changing or becoming more severe. And if the engineer gave it a 4-year time frame, the engineer is responsible to follow up and make sure it doesn't need to be repaired prior to that 4-year time frame. This is different from the facade law. We're not required to do this. And I'm not sure how this is going to work also in conjunction with that annual observation checklist. But this is the way it's written in the rule and the law. And as I said, we had a stability analysis where the required structural loading conditions, and you have to calculate the load carrying capacity of your typical and worst case structural framing members, which show that the structure is stable under current and expected loading conditions. And this is where, as Dennis said, it becomes important to really look at how the garage is being used and are they overloading the structure. Now, when you lease out your garage and the operator expects to pack X amount of cars in, that becomes complicated because you might find a situation where your engineer determines you can't occupy more than the number of cars that are listed on the building certificate of occupancy. And we're going to take a look in one moment. I'll show you where to find that on your certificate of occupancy. Here's an example of an annual observation checklist, which the QC must design for the garage. And it's not one form for every building. It should be really appropriate for the structure that you're looking at, where the someone who's competent. I don't know the definition of competent. It's really, it's left up to the owner's discretion, that somebody can walk around and check the floors, the beams, columns, joints, according to the engineer's checklist. And as I said, this checklist must be kept in a binder on site because the DOB will come around and ask for it. And the QC with your next filing period needs to review and report that you have complied on a yearly basis with this checklist.
And this was put out by the building department, was it not? As an
Well, this was
example?
their example, yes.
Right.
Mhm.
You'll see the first item on that list was protective coatings, which is always, and it says every 3 to 5 years. And that's typically within the life of most garage leases, and the protective sealants and coatings is usually a maintenance item that the tenant is responsible for. But that's these are some of the things you'll have to look at very carefully with your garage.
Real quick, just to confirm, the buildings in Queens don't need to do anything until about 2026, 2027. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right.
They're in the last cycle.
Got it. Thank you.
Only Brooklyn is in cycle 2. The other boroughs are in cycle 3.
Right, Brooklyn and Northern Manhattan. Mhm. So as we said, the engineer is going to want to take a look at the number of passenger vehicles that the garage was designed for. And many times we don't even have the original drawings, which is problematic. But if you look at the building certificate of occupancy, and we highlighted, you see in the column, it usually shows that there's a garage in the cellar, and it shows the number of passengers in the original design. In this case, it was 49 vehicles. And it also specifies how that parking is to be used, whether it's for tenants or can be used for commercial parking in and out type of situation. So this is important information because, as I noted, in commercially operated garages, they very rarely use this maximum number for loading. They try to squeeze in as many as they can with very little room in between the vehicles.
Kathy, so at the time, so for example, and that looks like kind of an older C of O, if it's at the time, let's say it's in the 60s or the 50s, I guess this C of O is from 1995. I don't really know when the building was built, but if it's an older building at the time, they really don't have the same level of, I guess, accuracy in terms of the design and design loading. I would assume they're sort of using, pencil and paper when they're doing this. They don't have the same tools that you do in your office when you design a new building. So if somebody has a C of O and it says I can only put 49 cars, can an engineer reevaluate the structure in some way, test the integrity of the structure, and see if it could, under the current code, handle more cars? Is there a way to do that, for example?
So I would say that the engineer can do a structural evaluation. If you don't have the original drawings, it is a little bit difficult to do, but it can be done. I don't know that you're going to get any change on your certificate of occupancy based on that. But as far as getting through the compliance mandate, I think you can make a very good argument that this is the structure, and we had the factor of safeties, and then and so this garage can accommodate. And I think engineers will be asked to, if they see that the garage operator is packing in the cars, the engineer is going to want to know that this structure, regardless of whether it's 49 or 52, how many are actually being packed into this structure, and can the structure hold these loads?
But at
So
the
I
moment,
would say
there's not a path forward if I actively want to adjust my C of O with regard to the car loading.
I don't think it would be based on, I mean, it would be based on many things, but loading is just one component, and then it has to do with spacing. They're certainly not going to allow you to load the way many commercial operators do load these garages. There's certain distance requirements and size of spaces and driveways and ramps that have to be kept clear.
Yeah, I've seen COs modified to add cars, but it's almost like a public assembly, license where you have to show the seating in the restaurant and how you get around. You have to show all the cars. But there is some leeway to the design professional here. For example, on this particular CO, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, it says cellar. And then it says the design live load, and where the upper floors, you can see 40 pounds per square foot. The cellar is designed as OG, and OG means on grade. So this is just a slab in the cellar where they're parking cars. So, overloading is not really that critical in this particular building, because you're parking in the cellar and the slab is right there on the ground.
It's the other
There's
factors.
no basement, there's no crawl space, there's nothing underneath it. It's on grade. So I would expect that the design professional looking at this certificate of occupancy would not be so focused on the total number of cars. But anytime you have a slab, a multi-level garage, you need to be very cognizant of the loading.
Good point. And here are the fees and penalties that you were asking about earlier. So if when you file the report, you're just like the facade law, you'll eventually go on DOB Now. Right now, all reports are just submitted via email. The DOB Now is not set up to handle this law yet. It will be shortly. The initial report is $305, which the owner generally pays through management online. Any amended subsequent reports are $85, and extension requests are $65. If you don't file, there are several penalties. You get a late filing initially of $1,000 per month past the deadline, plus you get a failure to file of $5,000 per year. That $1,000 a month does go up the longer you wait to file. So if you wait 3 years, it'll be more than $1,000, and you can easily accumulate $50,000, $60,000 in fines within a few years. Failure to correct an unsafe condition is $1,000 a month until corrected. And you also get a failure to correct a SREM condition of $2,000, which is a one-time penalty. The failure to correct the unsafe condition of $1,000 a month does not apply if you file those time extension rules and regulations that I mentioned earlier. Every 90 days, the professional goes to the building department and gets you an extension. You will not be subject to these fines. It's the people who get the unsafe condition, don't do anything, don't get the time extensions, and just allow the condition to sit, which was very common, back in the early stages of the facade law, as you know. And we're going to look, and as I mentioned earlier, there are predominantly three types of garages in New York City. We have the precast concrete, we have these slabs made in factories, then they're moved and assembled in the field. They have greater number of joints and connections which undergo stress reversals from up and down motion of cars. So those joints and connections are the critical parts of the structure that the engineer is going to want to inspect. And the joints can become very fatigued when the connections fracture. We have cast in place concrete, which is probably the most common that's being built right now. It does not suffer from the same connection failures that plague precast. The concrete's mixed in a plant, but then it's transferred to and poured and cured on site, where the conditions are very variable. So there's a lot of potential for error. Time is money. These construction happens very quickly. I can tell you, we've been on many sites where the rebars are rolling against the base of the formwork, and you have inappropriate concrete cover. And so those are the structures that I'm going to break down the fastest. We have placement of steel reinforcement is critical to achieve the structural capacity and long-term durability. Insufficient concrete cover increases the potential for corrosion from chloride-laden moisture. Corrosion leads to expansion of steel, delamination of concrete, and spalling. And this is the most common condition that we see in garages. We're going to take a look at a few examples. The finished concrete may be susceptible to cracking and chloride intrusion from de-icing chemicals or freeze-thaw cycling open to the environment. And then we're looking at steel frame garages where we have structural steel members for columns, beams, and joists. The support concrete parking decks. The decks are formed and cast in place, or they're placed on galvanized or composite decks, which are usually corrugated steel. The decks are susceptible to similar quality control and deterioration as the cast in place concrete. Metal decks can corrode from chloride or direct exposure to moisture, and steel members are susceptible to corrosion as the coatings wear. They may be covered with fireproofing if it's located beneath the building. So we have to look for those fireproofing failures, but we also may have to take off the fireproofing in order to see the size of the members when we're doing that stability analysis if the structure warrants.
So it's safe to say that a building that is exposed to the elements and or adjacent to, say, you know, prevailing winds and seawater will take more damage and more erosion than ones that don't?
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. So in our initial assessment, we're going to gather information, do an initial walk through the garage to observe stress and patterns. We're going to look for spalling concrete. We're looking for cracks, corrosion, staining, leaks coming through, condensation, ponding water. We're going to evaluate the type of construction, the age, any modifications that were made. And we want to obtain, or we have to prepare drawings to document the locations of all the conditions as we mentioned earlier. So upon initial investigation, these may be very common conditions. This may or may not be anything that is going to turn into an unsafe condition, but certainly is something that needs to be maintained, where we have the decks falling and patches failing. The salt comes in on the tires with the vehicles. It's no way to prevent it other than to apply appropriate coatings to the floors, which are very common nowadays. Very frequently when there are leaks, no one likes to spend money in the garage, particularly if you have a rear courtyard roof that is over the garage and there's water infiltration. The operators try to protect the cars because otherwise they're getting claims from paint and efflorescence coming down and staining the paint of the car. So the garage operators hang these deflectors and plastic sheets, and a lot of times these leaks are just left uncorrected for many years. Another example, someone just hangs a sheet across, collects the water, nobody addresses the problem. You know, another example, this is a garage where the ramp is underneath a garden. And it's also very common when you're outside of New York City. And you see there's just no maintenance. The gardens have to be dug up and the membranes replaced in order to keep the structure in stable condition. We have running water a lot of times, gardens on the other side, active watering systems that just allow a lot of water to bleed into the garage.
Why would a garden matter?
Oh, because gardens have sprinklers and the sprinklers have perpetual water, and sometimes the gardens are on the opposite wall of the garage. And if there are any cracks in the garage wall, the water will come bleeding through. The water will corrode the internal steel reinforcement in the wall, and the expansion and corrosion of that steel will cause the cracking to exacerbate and lead to structural failures eventually.
So it's safe to say that waterproofing is critical to prevent water infiltration?
Absolutely. So here's where the garage condition assessment, you know, goes to the outside to see what's on the other side of this wall and what corrective conditions might be required on the opposite end of the wall.
What about solar panels? Like we've been hearing lately, buildings looking to put solar panels on top of the space on where the garage would that be also potentially harmful because of the weight?
In terms of an outdoor parking structure?
Like, so say there's a roof And it's like the top of the roof is where the end of the parking structure is, and then people would put, because there's nowhere beautiful, like you can't put a field or, you know, garden on top of that portion. Some of the buildings are looking to put solar panels on top of that. Would
It might
that
be possible. You have to look at every project on its own merits, of course, you know, but that might be possible.
And it's just a matter of being done appropriately and to make sure the flashing details are appropriate, just like you'd put solar panels on the roof of any building. You want to make sure that it's detailed and installed and maintained, most importantly, correctly. So it is possible, but it's also another possible cause.
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Allow
Yeah.
water into the structure, sure, if it's not done and maintained appropriately.
You
Or
saw
if they're
earlier
heavy.
slide- on an earlier slide, there was quite a long list of appurtenances. We talked about the electric charging stations and guardrails and all sorts of things. So, you know, solar panels would just be another appurtenance that have to be looked at.
So because these garages are mostly located in cellar structures where the main electricity for the building comes in, and then we have a situation where water is just allowed to perpetually come in. So water and electricity is not a good combination. So these are very, very important to maintain these structures in a watertight condition.
This is very common with Con Ed.
Yeah. And particularly with all the street work that's being done on
Yeah.
the outside. Waffle slabs, you look up and you see your ceiling looks like a waffle. Very common type of construction that's cast in place. When you see the cracks occurring in two directions, it could lead to structural failures. So these become potentially unsafe conditions that must be taken care of. Here also we have extensive cracking along the beams, and it's important for the engineer to determine, is this concrete, purely concrete cover acting as the fireproofing on a steel structure, or is it a reinforced concrete structure where the cracking may be more prominent and more dangerous. Very, very common, you look up, you see the spalling of concrete from these corroding steel rebars in the slabs. Very, very common. It's up to the QC to decide, does the slab need to be repoured, or can I repair this in place?
Those are the long-term effects of a membrane that's breaking down. Either a membrane that's under a garden area above, or the traffic coating that's the protective layer on top of the floor above. But that's from water migration.
And these diagonal cracking in these CMU block partitions may not be as significant. Maybe you get a 5 or 6 year time frame to make some correction. You want to make sure that the block is all stabilized, and it may just be a caulking on the crack type of repair that's quite easy. This is a significant condition which would be an unsafe condition. Looking up at the ceiling. And, you know, here we have, this is not located within a building, so you don't see the same fireproofing, but you see that corrugated steel decking, the deflection, the water, which was allowed to penetrate for years. You see the rusting of the steel beams. Once again, your engineer has to determine, you know, if you need to replace the steel, or if reinforcements, it just needs to scrape everything down, reinforce and recoat. This crack may be very superficial. It may just be concrete cover over a steel column. Here we have a parapet wall over a garage structure where we have movement in the parapet, so the facade would be included in this assessment. And in this initial assessment, we need to review the original drawings. We need to review all past reports. And as I said, it's very important to make sure your locations are clearly indicated in your report. In this case, we did a reflected ceiling plan, which is a plan looking up at the ceiling, and all the little circles you see and indications are showing the conditions, and then there'll be a legend showing what the conditions are, what the repairs are. So the next engineer who comes along will need to verify and certify that those repairs were done, at least they're location specific. So if new cracks develop, you can show the building department the repairs were done, and now these are new conditions. So this is very, very important. We want to classify all of our conditions. These cracks in these columns side by side are quite different. On the left, that's the column we showed you earlier that may be very insignificant, yet the column on the right is clearly an unsafe condition that required shoring and immediate remediation. And once again, it's structural repairs versus maintenance work. Do we need to secure the premises or not? That's always the biggest question. Taking a look at any structural concerns. In this situation, this was a waffle slab. We had to secure the premises. You can see how long this water was leaching through the system, absolutely corroding the steel reinforcement within. So we vacated just a portion of the garage and installed these temporary columns to support the slab. So this was the ramp underneath the main ramp above. So it was very important to add stability. But to consider that the garage is going to lose revenue, and how you're going to negotiate with your garage operator, or how inconvenient this is going to be to residents who come back from work and want to park their car. And I know we've reached the time limit, Christopher, so I don't know if you want me to continue, or do we want to summarize at this point?
I will defer to my boss.
Oh, no, I think you should. Yeah, we can definitely keep going. I think there's interest.
Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't want to overstay my welcome. So I'm almost done. But on the initial assessment, we had the on-site testing, probes, and evaluation. Requires services of contractors, testing agencies, and specialists, as I mentioned earlier. It's very disruptive. So you really want to make sure you schedule this to avoid peak usage hours. In this case, we need to locate, this is a reinforced concrete structure. We needed to locate where the rebars and find out what the size of the rebars were inside the concrete. So we brought in an infrared testing company to do a scan of the concrete. And as you can see, the contractor maps out, he scans the concrete and maps out wherever he detects there's steel located. And if I have to do any core samples, I want to know where the steel is, because I want to make sure I can core through the concrete without interfering with any structural steel. And then we want to measure, we want to take a look at how much steel is left on steel rebars. We want to measure distance between the bars. That's very important for our structural stability analysis, measuring the thickness of steel members that we might encounter. So you see, it's also quite destructive. While we're doing the scan, we also have to open up the concrete to verify what the sizes are once we know where the rebar is located. And here, measuring spacing between rebar, we're measuring the spacing of the concrete cover, which protects the steel rebar from oxidation. We'll take a simple hammer, it might be a rubber mallet, and every engineer has their own technique and own instruments they like to use. We want to sound out, and as I said, the building department requires 10% of the structure be sounded out by the engineer. You're listening for hollow sounds or things that may be internal and may be indicative of a problem where the cracking hasn't come through the concrete yet. Here we're doing core drilling, so important to know where my steel reinforcement is in that slab. We're doing a compressive test of the concrete in order to do the stability analysis, and we're doing a petrographic analysis of the various components of the aggregate and taking a look at various components of the concrete mix. And we may have to use laboratories, material sampling in order to analyze this data. In this case, the contractor mapped out where he took the cores, and he notes that 3 attempts were made at cores 5A, B, and C. All 3 attempts were unsuccessful because he reached rebar and was not able to drill all the way through. There was no infrared done on this structure, so they cored blindly. In this situation, we need to determine the compressive strength. We send it out to a laboratory. As you see, this particular sample, we have an average of almost 4,100 PSI, so the engineer will determine if that's appropriate. We're looking to see the chloride content of the concrete when doing the evaluations, and so that core that's done is sent to a testing laboratory to measure the chloride, the salt content. We're documenting all the existing conditions, the observations, the evaluations of the causes, the analysis of these tests. We're developing repair strategies, making recommendations, priorities versus maintenance, very important. Estimated costs, most important for boards. Proactive protection for the future. So a condition may not exist, but perhaps because of all salts coming in, we have a high chloride content. We want to proactively put nice coatings down on the slabs so that we come back 6 years later, we're not going to see that concrete spalling and coming apart. And we want to make sure that the time frames for remediation are very clearly specified. We may proactively put We may monitor cracks and not necessarily repair them. Maybe we want to see if those cracks are active. So we'll put these little crack gauges and we'll come back periodically to see if there's active movement or if these cracks are old and dormant.
That'll be part of the annual checklist.
It might be the annual checklist, and we'll teach the garage operator how to read that. We want to make sure these coatings on these slabs are protected. Very important. They're not structural, but they will certainly contribute to long-term durability. Engineer has to determine if you have a lot of extensive spalling because you didn't have protective coatings. Do we have to replace the whole slab, or can we just do partial replacement, or can we just do spot patching? In this case, the steel reinforcement was quite deteriorated and they decided to do a replacement, but they left the base of the slab in place. In this case, the engineer determined that to cut out the deteriorated section over a steel frame. This is not located inside of a building. It was an independent structure, and they'll pour new concrete. And that was the extent of the repair. In this case, the engineer has to determine, is the spalling or are my defective areas too extensive to patch? So when overhead patching is feasible, engineer will always try to specify that first because it's it's most cost effective and least disruptive to the garage. It may determine that we have carbon fiber strips that add tensile reinforcement to the underside of slabs. Maybe we want to wrap the columns in this carbon fabric. Very frequently done, and it's up to the CUPC to make these recommendations to add strength. And as I said, we want to maintain these coatings. These are very popular, new epoxy coatings. These protect the slabs. This, obviously, we have to vacate the structure. So while parking decks experience the most wear and tear, we also want to make sure that all the columns, spandrels, vehicle, pedestrian guards, stair towers, parapets warrant review during the assessment, and potentially mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems may be included, but that is not included in the law. So at this point, I think we've gotten through. I think we've addressed most. The following slides address most of the repair strategies and whatnot that we've touched upon throughout this presentation. So, are there any additional questions?
This has been really, really thorough. I think we've been getting great questions throughout, so this has been fantastic. I think just maybe your additional commentary is just for note we do have some questions coming in, but I think real quick, are CUPC recommendations absolute, or can an owner choose to reevaluate?
That's very interesting. So the owner has to go on DOB now and accept the CUPC's report. If you don't file the report, you can absolutely get a second opinion. Mm-hmm. When you file the report and you sign the report, that means you understand the CUPC's recommendations. It's very hard to overturn those recommendations once the report is filed. So if you think you don't like the findings and you want a second opinion, do so before you file a report. And that's why it's important to get in the garages early before your filing deadline. I can't tell you how many people are going to be calling, 2 months before the deadline, and then there's really no time to bring in other opinions. That was a good question.
Real quick, would you be able to go back to the slide that shows the epoxy coating?
No, not far to go.
Great, thank you. Someone just wanted to take a look at this again.
Okay. These are becoming quite common now in garages, particularly with this new law, because the protection of the concrete, everybody realizes the significance, and the repairs are so expensive that the coatings are just a fraction, to protect.
And you can get them in different colors, so don't think that you're stuck with this color. Colors.
Yes, absolutely.
You can go purple, pink, whatever you like.
Oh, great.
Don't recommend it though.
But Chris, real quick, for our boards that are looking for guidance and next steps, knowing that these are coming up, how do you, from an AKAM perspective, provide guidance on just what to expect and how to plan?
Number one is, you want to make sure that you're onboarding a CUPC that is, an official CUPC, somebody who actually has the qualification, like Kathy and her team, somebody who has extensive knowledge doing this type of work. Mm-hmm. You don't really want, a newbie inspecting your garage that's not familiar with all these things. I can imagine that the team here from Midtown Preservation can walk into a garage and it's like seeing the lines on the matrix, you know, you see all the red flags, you see the outlights or the stalagmites and all the different things, and you just sort of, they know what they're looking at. And that's the kind of thing that you want to start with, is make sure that you're having the right people on board. So I would say that's number one. And then number two, you know, we need, I think we want to not panic, right? I think there's, I think the Surfside collapse and the upstate parking garage collapses have caused a lot of anxiety. However, I will say though that, you know, several of these items that have been addressed here are like the coding, for example, are preventative measures, right? And so once you get your garage squared away, maybe you've neglected your garage and it's, you know, serviceable, it's repairable, what have you. But once you know, you've gotten it back in good working order, then we highly recommend that you then now get on the train of preventative maintenance and care for your garage. That way you're not having to break the bank to repair it every 6 years so extensively. You'd rather get like a safe report as opposed to an unsafe report. You know, and if you're doing things like coding, if you're, you know, doing your regular annual inspections and you're following up, you're doing your patching and things like that, you know, as needed, addressing things early, then that's really going to help you in the long run. You know, I imagine that as Kathy and her team here would tell you, when you neglect things, it's exponential in terms of the damage that it will ultimately do, and not to mention the cost that it will require to fix it. Preventative maintenance is a fraction of the cost that repairing negligence is.
Good advice, thank you. Okay, so the garage is part of the condo building, but it is privately owned. Who is responsible for the cost to repair any unsafe conditions?
I think it kind of depends. I imagine it's going to depend on, well, so for example, if it's a privately owned garage, if it's a condo, like you said, for example, then theoretically it would be on the condo owner, unless of course there's something different in the offering plan, right? When the garage was purchased, there's all kinds of a wide range of agreements that have gone on. I would be shocked if any structure would sell a parking garage as a condo, a sponsor selling their garage as a condo, and didn't expect in that agreement that the maintenance of the garage would be on the condo owner. However, as Kathy mentioned, you know, the Department of Buildings is going to, unless it has a separate building information number, a BIN, then, or identification number, they're going to just look for the corporation of the building, right, to go after them. But I mean, of course, you know, you'll have to meet with your counsel and pass the buck as needed. But they are going to be expecting that it's done by the corporation, whoever's on the multiple dwelling registration, provided it's a, you know, not a standalone parking structure. They're going to look at who the corporation is.
Got it, thank you. What is the timeline for re-inspection following the completion of repairs?
I will defer to Kathy.
So if the building is classified as SREM, you do not have to file a subsequent report until the next cycle. And it's up to the engineer in the next cycle to certify that the repairs were done. If you are unsafe, you have, I believe it's 2 weeks. I believe it's 2 weeks to file a amended report. So amended reports are for unsafe reports, and you can take an unsafe report and make it SREM, or you can make it safe, depending on if you've completed the repairs. There are owners who decide to only correct unsafe conditions. Particularly, this is quite different from facades where you have to hang scaffolds and the mobilization is so costly. In this case, and it doesn't require sidewalk bridging for garages. So owners may choose to just repair unsafe conditions and take the report from unsafe into SREM, and then do the SREM conditions within 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, depending on what the QC determines. So unless you're unsafe, there's no time frame there's no requirement to file a report to take you down to safe. It's your next 6-year cycle.
Got it, thank you. Can you provide some information about the different types of coating sealants for a garage slab?
You want to, there's so many of them.
Yeah.
Urethanes, epoxy.
Tell us your
Well, maybe what's
favorites.
your recommended?
Tell us your favorites.
sealant?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your top
What you
fave?
want to do, you can see the aggregate, here, a lot of these get very slippery when they get wet. So broadcasting the aggregate into the epoxy is what is my favorite. You need to be able to have some sort of a tactile walking surface. People are in this garage, even if it's just the attendants, and occasionally other people going through. So I'm an epoxy fan, and you have to have a granular surface that gives you some grip on the bottom of your shoe.
We sent a specification out to bid a few months ago, and the coating manufacturers gave us various systems. And there was a 5-year system, which was the least expensive. And then there was a 10-year system. And I think it was a 25-year system, which was an incredible warranty for considering the garage use.
And that you're driving on it.
But it was extremely expensive. And so there are various different products and quality of products, and they'll give you different warranties depending on how much you want to spend. And the prices could range from $10 to $50 a square foot.
And they're different, they're graded for vehicular traffic.
Right.
As opposed to if you were doing something on a concrete balcony at the 8th floor, of your building, you'd be using a slightly different mixture. Because these have to be much more durable for, cars turning, wheels turning. There's a lot of weight and stress on these coatings.
And certainly outside structures need to be and need waterproofing qualities. Here we're only talking about protection when it's an inside, but the top level of an exterior garage is going to need a waterproofing surface. So is that, you're going to need a very tenacious membrane, and what kind of cover are you going to put over that membrane, because it's important to maintain. And you have to make sure that when the plows come to clear the snow off of the parking deck, that they're not ripping up your membrane. So you might put a concrete pour on top of that. So there's so many different systems and so many different factors and different recommendations, and it's hard to just.
And I wouldn't limit coatings to only areas where you have a space below. You might want to put a coating on the floor of the basement garage, just because it looks good. It's easy to maintain.
Got it. Are there certain types of, like, a length of type warranty that you're looking to obtain when you're thinking about the new traffic coding, like how long it should be? Mentioned certain time frames. Are there?
So
like the longer the better?
The most common are 5-year or 10-year, because the longer term warranties are very expensive. Now, the problem is a lot of these warranties contain ifs, ands, or buts and exclusions for salt. For different, if you overuse a garage, you park too many cars, and it really gets a lot of wear and tear. It's pretty much warranting that the surface will stay tightly adhered under normal wear and tear conditions. So in a garage, it's hard to determine what normal is, because they're used so differently.
And most of these systems can be patched. You can do small patches, and most of them you can go over with a fresh coat.
I assume you'll need certified installers and certified installer to do the patching to maintain the warranty, correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
Similar to roofing in that regard.
Exactly. And the traffic coatings that you put on balcony surfaces.
Got it. Okay, let's do one last question, and I guess final thoughts. So for the annual checklist, how is competent person defined?
A competent person is not defined, and we've asked the building department several times, and it's really left up to the owner. I mean, there is no definition, and I don't think that you're ever going to get a violation because someone deemed the report prepared by an incompetent person. So I think that it's someone reasonable, who knows what a crack looks like, who perhaps has the old repair to take a look at the old condition analysis report, to take a look at what the condition looked like at the time of inspection, and is the crack growing? Are conditions getting worse? So it could be a garage operator, could be, as I said, the building superintendent, it could be the maintenance man, or you can just decide that you don't want this responsibility. I'm going to call the engineer to come in and do a quick walkthrough. It's not very costly, a few $100s for an engineer to walk through, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Okay, great. Are you generally recommending additional or better lighting to be installed in garages as well when you're doing these updates?
Absolutely. And the CUBC is supposed to cite any other code violations that he or she observes. For instance, when cars are blocking exit doors and things of that nature, but certainly lighting is an issue. There is lighting requirements required in the New York City Building Code, and the CUBC should be aware of what the code requirements are. In order to become certified, the interview by the DOB could be quite extensive, and they want to make sure that you know what the code requirements are in these structures. So while you don't have to necessarily report on them all, you certainly have to bring to the owner's attention any violations that you observe. So lighting is a common violation, and we would recommend upgrading lighting in most situations. This photograph that we're showing now, actually, the garage is actually very well lit. So, but most cellar garages are poorly lit.
Could I also point out that keep in mind that codes are also minimums,
Yes.
you know, and there's no reason you can't go above and beyond the minimum. And also a lot of codes aren't retroactive. And I think it's safe to say that unfortunately garages are also stereotypically the places where bad things have happened.
Right.
So more lighting is also very good for surveillance. So you can see, you're aware of your surroundings, other people can see, and if you have cameras in that garage, the camera is actually going to be a whole lot more effective if there is a well illuminated space in order for it to document what's going on, like somebody breaking into a car or what have you.
So you're talking about light, but now we're thinking about local law 87. Can motion activated light be used, or is that in a different category?
I believe it can. I don't know the specifics of the electrical code on that, but I know you can use LEDs for one, and that'll already bring down your costs. And a lot of people are retrofitting for LEDs in terms of lighting. If memory serves, you're gonna have to, at the very least, meet the code minimum requirement for illumination of a parking garage and the code minimum for egress. And then as long as you're meeting that, the balance of the lights that you would have added in order to go above and beyond the code, that can all be on motion sensors as far as I know.
Okay, so now what about heat? So is it necessary to have heat below grade garages, heat in below grade garages?
Good question. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I don't think that heating, it's non-habitable space. It's
not required, but is it good or
required.
do you think it's good or bad is it good or
Yeah,
bad?
is there a deteriorating effect?
Well, look, if you have dripping snow, melting snow, and it's migrating down through the concrete, the sooner that you can get that to evaporate or to flash off, the better. So if having a heated environment helps the concrete stay dry, then that's a good thing.
Right. Okay, that's great.
It could also, I'm guessing it would also, wouldn't have as much fluctuation in the materiality as well. I guess that would be pretty difficult though, unless you're able to retain the heat and create a stable.
It's not an insulated space,
right.
and
I think
it's going to be quite expensive.
And every garage is different, people are trying to reduce energy consumption, but every garage is different. If you're 2 stories underground and it's really concealed space, it might be warm. You might have steam lines running through there or some other, mechanical systems for the building that provide some sort of radiant or residual heat to the space. If you're obviously above ground, it's different.
So just so everyone knows, we are recording this. I think there was a lot of interest. There was just, I think you really, you gave us a wealth of knowledge. I'm going to take one last question, and then we're going to circulate everyone's information after this, so that way the questions can continue. And you all at home can feel free to watch this again or reach out to Chris or Kathy and her team to answer any questions that you might have. But we really appreciated our guests' time. So 2 more questions. The first question is, what about exhaust systems for moisture? What are your thoughts on that?
That's kind of a random question. Maybe I'll pass it to you guys after. I was thinking that, there's a code minimum regarding ventilation in parking garages, and we regularly see that the ventilation systems are not properly maintained. I'm imagining that the this local law, is not going to evaluate ventilation and not be required as a part of the report. But as we all know, that your building must be code compliant and be kept in reasonable repair, I think is the term. So if it is a requirement that ventilation be maintained, it should be maintained. And if you are ventilating a space, I think it's less about moisture, like retaining moisture in your space. Obviously, moisture is not good for the slab, but the ventilation is less about moisture and more about toxic fumes from CO2 and carbon monoxide from the vehicles themselves.
Understood. Okay, and the last question, and then everyone, please feel free to reach out to Chris, Dennis, or Kathy, and they will be happy to answer. But during demolition overhead, are there any concerns with residential commercial spaces above and the sound vibration impact?
Well, very often, some of the deterioration that we see is from, a deli or a restaurant where the floor in the kitchen or in the bathrooms has not been waterproofed. If you're doing a renovation in the upstairs apartment, you're going to make the person put waterproofing under the floor in the bathrooms and in wet areas. That very often is neglected for commercial spaces. And it's a breakdown of the membrane. And we've been involved with projects where we've had to actually bring in that restaurant operator to close his kitchen for a time being, where we were doing work downstairs and make other kinds of repairs, and then take up his floor and put down waterproofing. So that can happen. And again, every project has to be looked at on its own and see what the issues are that are affecting it.
But yes, as far as vibrations are concerned, it'd be similar situation when you're replacing your roof and you have to do patching repairs on your concrete deck, and the vibration and noise and inconvenience to the residents who are on the upper floors. It's along the same line. We don't find too much damage underneath the residential portion of these parking structures. It's mostly, as Dennis said, under commercial spaces that have any moisture environments, or underneath, very frequently under courtyard roofs. The rear courtyard, the rear gardens are the garage very generally extends underneath these gardens, and those membranes are almost never maintained. Most of the time, 100-year-old buildings have the original membrane still. So those are situations where we find the concrete most deteriorated, not so much under the building's lobby or whatnot.
I would add that a concrete frame structure creates a lot more noise and vibration than a steel frame, like a pre-war building. Again, not to make a comparison to someone renovating an apartment, but it's much easier to create a duplex apartment in an old steel frame building, pre-war building. It's basically an erector set wrapped in concrete, and you can make the openings very easily. Whereas if you're trying to make a duplex in a concrete frame structure, and you're dealing with rebars and drilling and saw cutting, and everybody in that building is going to hear that you're making a duplex. So the nature of what the structure it is itself is going to answer some of these questions.
Great. This has been really informative. You all are phenomenal. Thank you so much for spending all this time with us and educating our client boards. And thank you, Chris, as well, for taking time to participate. And you all, thank you. So please feel free to we're going to circulate everyone's information after today. We're going to also circulate a recording of this, as well as some top 10 tips you can prepare, so that way you all can prepare for these upcoming garage inspections. And we hope you have a wonderful night and great weekend. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.